"You can't just leave me here," I whispered to no one, gripping the edge of the stainless steel counter as the fluorescent lights flickered above. The ER was quiet at 2:17 a.m., empty except for the distant hum of the ventilators and the occasional beep from the monitors, but my heart felt like it had its own rhythm, fast, irregular, alive. I had been working double shifts for weeks, caffeine barely masking exhaustion that pressed on my shoulders like weights, and yet nothing could have prepared me for the chaos that stormed through the doors 30 seconds later. Paramedics burst in, urgency rolling off them in waves, and the boy they carried barely moved, limp against the gurney, while alarms from the monitors screamed before we could even connect him. I dropped my pen, heart hammering, as I assessed him, every training I had flooding back at once: vitals, airway, circulation, keep the airway open, check the 4, stabilize. And then I heard him before I even looked up, the quiet command in a tone that made the room seem smaller, colder. Alexander Kane, tall, imposing, the kind of presence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, his silver suit immaculate even in the chaos, eyes sharp and calculating. Bloodied from the car accident that had brought him here, he scanned the room, aura of controlled power radiating off him, but when his gaze landed on me, Emily Carter, kneeling beside the gurney, checking the child's 4, I felt an instant awareness, a tightening, like I had been caught in a tide I couldn't fight. I didn't have time to think, only act, as I tore the edge of the blanket away, exposing his shoulder, assessing the deep gash that threatened more than it appeared. His dark eyes followed every movement, silent judgment, but not hostility, more like curiosity wrapped in control. I worked with precision, hands trembling slightly but steady, stitching the wound with movements trained to be efficient, deliberate, clean, every motion under the scrutiny of a man who could command armies but could not intervene in this small space of life and care. Sweat ran down my temple, mixed with the cold sting of the fluorescent light, but I ignored it. Voice low as I spoke to calm him, though he didn't flinch at the pain or the needle, only studied me. Minutes stretched like hours, the sterile smell of antiseptic thick in my nose, the boy stabilized, vitals steadying, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander Kane was cataloging, measuring, silently promising something in the tilt of his jaw and the narrowing of his eyes. When I finally leaned back, wiping my hands, he stepped closer, boots clicking on the tile, the sound loud in the otherwise empty ER. His presence filled the space, authoritative but not threatening, and he said simply, low and even, "Find her." My heart caught, the words echoing in the small room, layered with the weight of command and the unspoken meaning beneath them. I swallowed, feeling the pulse in my throat, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline, knowing that the night had just begun, that this encounter, brief as it was, had already shifted something irreversible, a tether pulled between us by circumstances neither of us had chosen, yet both recognized. And as he walked toward the exit, eyes never leaving mine, I realized the quiet truth: this was more than a wound being stitched, more than a life being saved, it was the beginning of an entanglement I could not yet understand, a story written in shadows, urgency, and the unspoken promise of protection that carried with it the weight of possession and the inevitability of destiny. The night had not yet loosened its grip over the city, rain still streaking the windows of the emergency room as I moved to organize supplies, hands damp with antiseptic and sweat. Alexander Kane was seated upright now, a white sheet draped over his shoulders, eyes scanning the monitors with measured focus, the sharp lines of his face softened only slightly by the trust implicit in allowing me to tend to him. My fingers lingered over the bandages I had just applied, double-checking each stitch, each knot, every movement deliberate, controlled, precise, as if by some silent agreement we both understood the importance of patience in moments like this. He shifted slightly, the subtle sound of leather brushing against tile catching my attention, and I realized he had been observing me all along, taking in the cadence of my movements, the rapid pulse in my wrist, the controlled breathing I forced to maintain clarity. I kept my eyes on the instruments, murmuring reassurances to myself as much as to him: everything is stabilizing. You are going to be okay, though he made no sound, no acknowledgement beyond a small nod that carried more weight than words. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was joined by the distant siren of another ambulance, a reminder that life in this part of the city did not pause for anyone, and yet for these few moments, the ER felt removed from time, isolated, a suspended bubble where only he and I existed, each of us aware of the unspoken rules binding us. I straightened, adjusting the 4 lines and repositioning the monitor cables, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly, the adrenaline of the initial chaos gradually settling into a quiet alertness, a steady focus that allowed me to take in the details of the room, the precise angle of his gaze, the tension in his jaw, the measured way he shifted his weight on the gurney. He did not speak, did not issue a command, but I sensed the weight of expectation, of observation, a silent judgment tempered by curiosity. I stepped back, hands resting lightly on the counter, and for the first time, I allowed myself a breath that was not tethered to immediate action. The slight tilt of his head, the way his eyes followed mine, told me he recognized the difference between skillful action and hesitation, and perhaps more importantly, recognized the courage required to act when the stakes were high. A knock at the door drew my attention, a nurse entering with fresh supplies, but I barely noticed, caught in the web of unspoken understanding that had formed between us. He did not ask for more, did not issue an order, yet the intensity of his presence made the room feel smaller, the air thicker, as if the very oxygen carried the weight of expectation and awareness. I continued my rounds, checking monitors, adjusting lines, making sure he was comfortable, aware that each movement was observed, catalogued, weighed for meaning. The quiet tick of the wall clock marked passing seconds, but it felt stretched, elongated, as though every instant mattered, every small gesture a note in an unspoken dialogue that had begun the moment I had first touched the wound. I moved deliberately, stepping lightly, speaking softly, my voice barely above the hum of the machines, yet resonant enough to mark my presence, my role, my competence, each action asserting that I was present, capable, and aware. He shifted again, eyes narrowing slightly, and I realized he had seen something in my steadiness, in the way I controlled panic, managed uncertainty, that he had long recognized in those who were in trust through competence. The thought made a tight coil of pride and apprehension in my chest, a recognition that even in the sterile confines of the emergency room, our paths had converged in a way that defied simple explanation, a connection formed in quiet intensity, in vigilance, in the careful orchestration of life-saving care, and I knew that the night, with its rain and hum of distant sirens, would not soon release either of us from the gravity of this encounter. The fluorescent lights flickered again, shadows stretching long across the tile floor as I moved to adjust the monitor near Alexander Kane. His presence seemed to fill the room even more than before, the quiet intensity in his gaze keeping me alert, every movement precise, deliberate, intentional. I checked his pulse, steady now, and the slight color returning to his skin was reassuring, yet the tension in the space remained palpable, charged, as if each breath we drew was measured and significant. He shifted slightly, leather shoes clicking against the tile, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent room, and I felt the pull of his attention, precise, unwavering, as he followed each step I took. I straightened the sheet across his shoulder, ensuring it lay smooth, and he watched, unblinking, every small motion recorded in his perceptive eyes. I spoke softly, "The bleeding has stopped, and your vitals are steady. You should rest," but he did not respond with words, only a subtle nod that carried weight far beyond its simplicity. The clock ticked in the background, each second stretching longer than it should, the hum of the monitors and the distant sound of traffic outside blending into a rhythm I could almost count on. I adjusted the drip line, watching the fluid move with a slow, steady cadence, aware that he observed every detail, every minor correction I made, and it made my movements deliberate, careful, almost choreographed, though I tried to make them appear effortless. My hands, slightly damp with the antiseptic, moved with precision, and I felt the adrenaline lingering just beneath the surface, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could shift. Alexander shifted again, a subtle change in posture, the slight furrow of his brow, the measured exhale, all conveying more than words ever could, an unspoken assessment, a silent acknowledgement of competence and focus. I continued checking monitors, adjusting the bed, ensuring he was as comfortable as the circumstances allowed, and with each passing moment, I felt the weight of this connection, formed in quiet intensity, the bridge between us built on necessity, trust, and the unspoken recognition that our paths had intersected in a way neither of us could reverse. I stepped back, hands resting lightly on the counter, heart still beating faster than I allowed myself to admit, and for a brief moment, allowed a breath that was not tethered to immediate action, aware that Alexander Kane was still watching, evaluating, present in a way that filled the room, that made each movement I took deliberate, meaningful. The steady beeping of the monitors became a background rhythm, a heartbeat we shared in silence, and as I arranged supplies for the next patient, I felt the awareness of his presence linger in the space between us, a subtle gravity that held me, measured, attentive, aware that even in the stillness of the emergency room, our connection, forged in urgency and care, was quietly, irrevocably forming. The steady rhythm of the monitors filled the room, each beep a pulse that seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat as I adjusted the bandages on Alexander Kane one final time. The rain outside had slowed, pattering softly against the windows, creating a faint background melody that contrasted with the tension still lingering in the emergency room. I stepped back, letting my hands rest briefly on the counter, and caught a glimpse of him in the reflection of the polished stainless steel, a man who commanded presence even in repose, eyes observing every detail of the space, every motion I made, yet not intrusively, only with the quiet force of awareness. I moved toward the supply cart, retrieving a fresh pack of sterile gauze, and the faint rustle of paper seemed amplified in the stillness, drawing his attention. His gaze met mine, subtle but deliberate, a silent acknowledgement that this was not simply about tending to a wound, it was about the care taken in the smallest of actions, the precision and dedication that defined the moment. I murmured softly, testing the air with light conversation, "Do you need anything else before we get you settled?" And he tilted his head slightly, a minimal gesture that carried weight, and I realized he was weighing my words, not dismissing them, but considering their intent and the steadiness behind them. The clock ticked steadily, each second a marker of progress, of recovery, yet also of the growing understanding between us, a tension that was subtle, unspoken, yet tangible, like the pull of gravity between two objects in motion, invisible yet undeniable. I adjusted the four-line, ensuring it was free from kinks, and the fluid flowed evenly, the drip a metronome for the quiet rhythm that had settled over us. Alexander shifted, just enough to make the white sheet brush lightly against the edge of the counter, and I felt a small rush of awareness, a reminder that every motion in this room mattered, every glance, every pause, carried significance. I set down the gauze, taking a slow breath, allowing my shoulders to relax just slightly, but the alertness remained, a constant companion. The distant hum of traffic outside was softened by the thick hospital walls, yet it reminded me of the world beyond, the city moving relentlessly even as we existed in this suspended moment of focus and quiet intensity. I checked the monitors once more, eyes scanning the numbers, the rhythm of vital signs. Steady, reassuring, yet I could feel the silent weight of his attention, the measure of evaluation that did not demand acknowledgement, only recognition. I straightened the bed linens, smoothing creases, and the faint sound of fabric brushing against fabric seemed magnified in the hush of the room. He observed, unwavering, and in that gaze, I sensed both assessment and trust, the kind of connection that formed not from words but from shared understanding, presence, and the quiet authority of one who had survived by seeing, noticing, and acknowledging the smallest details. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once more, casting brief shadows across the tiled floor, and I felt the gravity of the moment, the careful, deliberate dance of awareness and action that tethered us in this room, each of us silently aware that this encounter, though anchored in necessity, had forged a connection that neither could ignore, a bridge between skill, responsibility, and the subtle acknowledgement of trust. The emergency room had settled into a quiet rhythm, the distant hum of machines and the occasional hiss of oxygen the only sounds accompanying the soft patter of rain against the windows. I moved deliberately, clearing a small area of the counter to prepare fresh supplies, each motion precise, measured, conscious of the watchful presence of Alexander Kane, who remained seated upright, shoulders squared, eyes tracking my every movement with a calm, unwavering focus. His gaze was steady, assessing, not intrusive, but impossible to ignore, a subtle reminder that even in silence, authority could be communicated without words. I adjusted the monitor leads, checking the readings, confirming stability, and as I straightened the sheets around him, I noticed a slight tilt of his head, a gesture that carried weight in its simplicity, signaling acknowledgement, an unspoken communication that the care I provided mattered, that he recognized the skill and attentiveness behind each action. My hands moved with the rhythm of experience, careful, deliberate, as I replaced the used gloves with a fresh pair, pulling them snug, the latex cool against my skin, and the scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint trace of rain that had seeped in through the hospital doors, creating an atmosphere both sterile and oddly comforting. I spoke softly, narrating my steps, as if by labeling each action I could further anchor both of us in the moment, checking vitals, adjusting the four, ensuring comfort, and his eyes followed, registering, understanding, a silent participant in the process that had begun with urgency but now settled into a careful observation. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, yet time seemed suspended, stretched by the intensity of our shared awareness, the quiet tension that had formed, not from fear, but from a mutual recognition of competence and attentiveness. I moved to the side of the bed, placing a hand lightly on the rail, allowing my presence to be felt without intrusion, maintaining balance between professional detachment and compassionate care. He shifted again, imperceptibly, and I sensed the weight of his consideration, the quiet evaluation that came from a lifetime of observing, judging, and understanding people through their actions rather than their words. I adjusted the blanket once more, smoothing folds, and the small gesture seemed to resonate, his posture relaxing just slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of trust forming in this shared, unspoken space. The soft glow from the hallway light filtered through the frosted windows, casting elongated reflections across the tile floor, shadows that danced gently with the rhythm of the room, creating a visual counterpoint to the measured cadence of beeps and hums that filled the space. Each movement I made, each adjustment, each careful touch, carried meaning, reinforcing the fragile connection that had begun with urgency but now existed in quiet observation and mutual respect, a bridge formed from precision, attentiveness, and the unspoken understanding that even in moments of calm, the presence of another person could be felt profoundly, their influence subtle but undeniable, shaping the energy of the room, guiding each action with an invisible hand that spoke of awareness, trust, and the quiet power of connection. The hum of the monitors continued, a steady pulse in the otherwise quiet emergency room, and I moved carefully around Alexander Kane, checking the floor and adjusting the bedding so that he was comfortable, aware that every movement I made was observed, noted, and silently assessed. The soft glow from the overhead lights highlighted the sharp features of his face, the controlled expression that betrayed nothing yet conveyed a presence that filled the room, commanding attention even without words. I murmured reassurances as I worked, more to guide my own hands than for his hearing. "We are keeping everything stable. You are recovering steadily," and his eyes followed, calculating, attentive, a quiet acknowledgement of my skill and care. I reached for a fresh set of gloves, the latex cool against my skin, and I felt a faint tension ease in the air, though the undercurrent of watchfulness remained, palpable, precise. He shifted slightly, just enough to brush the sheet against my wrist, and the subtle contact was a reminder that every movement mattered, every gesture noticed, even the small acts of adjusting lines or smoothing linens. I spoke softly, labeling my actions aloud as I organized supplies and confirmed vitals, adjusting monitor leads, checking pulse, verifying comfort, each phrase deliberate, anchoring the room in purpose and quiet focus. Alexander's presence was calm but undeniable, a silent gravity that required attention without demanding it, and I felt the weight of his awareness as I moved about, ensuring everything was in order, steady, prepared for whatever might come next. I straightened the sheets, smoothing the folds with careful precision, and the rustle of fabric against fabric seemed amplified in the hush of the room, each sound a note in the quiet symphony that had formed between us. The faint trace of rain outside seeped through the glass, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and city streets, adding a rhythmic backdrop to the controlled activity within, a contrast to the chaos that had brought him here earlier. I checked the monitor again, confirming that the vital signs remained stable, and as I adjusted his position slightly to alleviate tension in his shoulder, I sensed the subtle shift in his posture, a small indication of trust, recognition, or acknowledgement that he understood the care I was taking, the competence I brought to each precise motion. The clock ticked on, its steady rhythm echoing the pulse of the machines and my own heightened awareness, the quiet tempo reinforcing the careful balance of presence, skill, and attention that defined this encounter. Every step I took, every movement, every glance carried meaning, contributing to the silent dialogue of observation and understanding that had grown between us since the moment I first attended to him. I felt the tension of responsibility settle lightly on my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a focus that sharpened my awareness, reminding me that each careful action, each quiet word, each deliberate gesture contributed to the ongoing connection that had formed, a bridge of trust and attentive care that neither of us had anticipated but now could not ignore, shaping the space and the time we occupy together in this suspended, charged moment of shared vigilance and quiet intensity. The quiet of the emergency room was interrupted only by the soft, rhythmic beeping of the monitors as I moved to check Alexander Kane's vitals once more, the fluorescent lights reflecting faintly off the polished tile floor. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, casting streaks of silver across the windows, and the distant hum of the city reminded me that the world beyond this room continued its restless pace. I adjusted the sheets around him, smoothing the folds, making certain the blanket rested comfortably over his shoulders while my hands moved with deliberate precision, each gesture measured and intentional. He watched without expression, eyes steady, yet there was a subtle shift in his posture, the tiniest acknowledgement that he recognized my care, my attentiveness, the hours I had spent tending to his wounds with meticulous focus. I retrieved fresh gauze and disinfectant from the supply cart, arranging them neatly on the counter, and felt his gaze follow every movement, cataloging each detail silently, without interruption, yet impossible to overlook. I murmured instructions aloud to myself, labeling my actions, checking vitals, adjusting for, ensuring comfort, each phrase a small anchor to the moment, grounding both of us in this controlled intensity. His presence was calming yet commanding, a paradox of authority conveyed not through speech, but through quiet observation, measured breathing, and an unwavering focus that seemed to tether the room to a delicate balance of awareness and respect. I stepped closer to adjust a monitor lead, careful to maintain space, aware that even the smallest movement carried significance, and the way his eyes followed me, unblinking, lent weight to the notion that our interactions were building an unspoken dialogue, each action interpreted, each gesture registered. The sterile scent of the room mingled with the faint aroma of rain through the vents, creating a unique atmosphere, one of focus, alertness, and subtle tension that carried an underlying current of trust. I straightened a pillow behind his back, smoothing the linen once more, and felt the quiet acknowledgement of his presence, the unspoken understanding that care given with attention and skill could forge connections without words. Every sound seemed amplified, the gentle drip of fluid, the soft rustle of fabric, the occasional footstep from a passing nurse, all underscored by the hum of the monitors, creating a rhythm that marked the passage of time in this suspended space. Alexander shifted slightly, a micro-movement that communicated more than speech, a subtle signal that the connection between us was acknowledged, fragile yet tangible, and I sensed the weight of this silent agreement, the understanding that the care I provided was noticed, respected, and in some way reciprocated through attention alone. Each breath, each careful adjustment, reinforced the unspoken bond, the quiet rhythm of vigilance and focus that had grown from urgency into a controlled, attentive presence shared between us, a tether formed from precision, awareness, and the steady, deliberate patience that defined this encounter, and I knew that this moment, suspended in quiet intensity, was establishing a foundation for something neither of us had anticipated, yet both understood would shape the hours to come. The quiet tension in the emergency room had settled into a steady rhythm, punctuated only by the soft beeping of the monitors and the occasional hiss of the oxygen system. I moved deliberately, adjusting the bedding around Alexander Kane so that he was comfortable, each motion precise, careful, intentional, while his eyes followed every detail, unblinking, calculating, assessing, not with judgment but with an undeniable awareness that made the room feel charged with subtle intensity. I checked the 4 lines, confirming the fluid was flowing evenly, and I spoke softly, narrating my actions, adjusting monitor, checking vitals, ensuring comfort, words that served more to anchor my own focus than to communicate, yet he acknowledged them with the faintest shift of his head, a silent affirmation of recognition and trust. The rain outside had softened to a whisper, streaking the windows with thin lines of silver light that reflected the sterile glow of the overhead fluorescents, creating patterns across the floor that moved gently as if in conversation with the rhythm of the room. I retrieved a fresh gauze pack and disinfectant, arranging the items on the counter in neat, deliberate order, aware that his attention remained fixed on every motion, registering precision and care in a manner that transcended words. His presence was calm but commanding, a silent authority that did not intrude yet was impossible to ignore, a gravity that subtly shaped my movements, made each adjustment deliberate, purposeful, each small action weighted with significance. I straightened the sheets again, smoothing the folds, the soft rustle amplified in the quiet, marking the passage of time and the careful attention that underpinned every gesture. I murmured reassurance, "You are stabilizing, everything is in order," and though he did not respond verbally, the subtle relaxation in his posture suggested comprehension, a quiet acknowledgement that the care provided was noted, respected, and understood. I moved to check the monitor again, confirming the stability of his vitals, noting the regular rhythm of the pulse, the steady breath, and the slight relaxation of tension in his shoulders as he allowed himself to settle more comfortably into the bed. Each action, each small adjustment, reinforced the unspoken bond forming in this space, a connection built on precision, attentiveness, and a shared awareness that, while silent, carried weight, meaning, and a quiet trust that had grown from the urgency of his arrival into the careful observation and measured care that now defined the room. The faint echo of footsteps in the corridor reminded me of the world beyond the ER, yet within these walls, a bridge had been quietly forged, tethered not through words, but through the attentive presence, deliberate motions, and the careful orchestration of space, care, and awareness, creating a moment suspended in time where every gesture, glance, and breath carried significance, binding us together in quiet intensity and mutual understanding. The first rays of dawn filtered through the tall windows of the emergency room, casting a soft, golden light over the tiled floors and reflecting off the polished stainless steel surfaces. Alexander Kane sat upright, sheet neatly draped across his shoulders, eyes following me with a calm intensity that spoke of awareness, attention, and a quiet authority that demanded respect without a single word. I moved with deliberate precision, checking the monitor once more, adjusting the 4, and ensuring the room was orderly, aware that every small motion carried weight, every careful action noted and acknowledged in his steady gaze. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the faint scent of wet asphalt drifting through the slightly ajar doors, mingling with the antiseptic and sterile air of the ER, creating a unique rhythm of presence and awareness that bound us together in the quiet hours between night and morning. I adjusted the pillow behind his back, smoothing the sheets with meticulous care, and murmured softly, labeling each action aloud, ensuring comfort, checking vitals, confirming stability, my voice steady, deliberate, marking each step in the careful choreography that had formed over the hours. Alexander's eyes followed, unblinking, registering the precision, recognizing the attentiveness, the skill, the deliberate care that had become our shared language in this space. I moved to the supply cart, arranging new gauze, wipes, and instruments, each item placed with thoughtful attention, aware that he was cataloging every detail silently, evaluating not just the motions, but the calm confidence behind them, the measured way I maintained focus under pressure. The faint ticking of the wall clock, the soft hum of the monitors, and the occasional distant sound from the hospital corridor created a background rhythm, a subtle underscore to the quiet, tense energy in the room. I straightened the sheets again, brushing off the smallest crease, and felt the subtle shift of his posture, a signal that the unspoken connection between us had grown, that trust, awareness, and mutual recognition had formed from urgency into deliberate attentiveness. Each breath, each movement, each careful gesture reinforced the bond that had developed, a bridge built on competence, vigilance, and quiet focus, connecting us without words, without explicit acknowledgement, yet palpable in the space between us. I stepped back briefly, hands resting lightly on the counter, feeling the gravity of his presence, the steady pull of his attention, and understood that this was no longer simply about tending to a wound or stabilizing vitals. This was about presence, awareness, the careful interweaving of observation and action, the silent promise that what had begun in urgency now existed in quiet, deliberate care, establishing a foundation that would guide the hours and decisions to come. As the golden morning light filled the room, I caught his gaze one last time, a shared understanding passing between us, subtle yet profound, a tether of trust and vigilance formed in the night that neither of us could ignore, a quiet certainty that the connection established here would influence what came next, shaping the rhythm, the attention, and the presence that defined our shared moment in this suspended space of care and awareness.